Hello everyone, my name is Jessa Quisil. This is my report on CA 200, which is Correctional Institution Module 2. So, in this lesson, we will talk about the history, philosophy, and objectives of imprisonment, the development of prisons, Sing Sing Prison, Auburn System, Pennsylvania System, 5 development of prisoners, forms of punishment, age of enlightenment, and personalities behind correctional institution. So first, let's talk about the history of imprisonment. So, the history of imprisonment is the original purpose of confining a person within the prison was not to punish them, but was a means of keeping the perpetrator of a crime detained until the actual punishment could be carried out. So, the perpetrator would not be suffers a pain, which is they're only confining it a person until the the results of the trial would be go out or carried out. This was usually in the form of corporal punishment that was intended to cause the guilty person pain, such as being beaten with a whip, or capital punishment, which use a variety of methods to claim the lives of condemned individuals. So, London is known as the birthplace of modern imprisonment. So next, Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher, was against the death penalty and thus created the concept of a prison that would be used to hold prisoners as a form of punishment. So, Jeremy Bentham was not agree about the death penalty. So Bentham drew up plans for a facility or create a plans in a facility in which prisoners would remain for extended periods of time. Jeremy Bentham was intended to ensure that the people who were locked up would never know if they were being watched by guards or not, which he felt would allow the prison to save money. So next, since the inmates could not be certain how many guards were present, Bentham reasoned fewer officers would need to be hired to maintain the peace. So, Bentham agreed that they need a fewer officers to maintain the peace of the inside of the prison. So in the end, this prison was never built, but the concept of using prisons as a form of long-term punishment did catch on. So, in 19th century, prisons were being built for the sole purpose of housing inmates. They were intended to deter people from committing crimes. In 19th century, there are only one built housing for inmates, which is intended to deter people or to discourage people to do that kind of behavior. So, people who were found guilty of various crimes would be sent to these penitentiaries and stripped of their personal freedoms. Inmates were often forced to do hard labor while they were incarcerated and to live in very harsh conditions. Before long, one of the goals of a prison sentence became the rehabilitation of inmates. Many people felt that the fear of being locked up would be enough to deter an inmate from ever committing another crime. But other theories held that policies should be introduced to help reform prisoners before they were set free. So, in this goal, the goal of the security or the system is to discourage the prisons to make another or to commit another crime. These policies include mental examinations, educational programs, and sometimes even far more drastic measures such as electroshock therapy. An opposing viewpoint to the rehabilitative effect of imprisonment claims that being incarcerated will actually cause people to become even more involved with a life of crime because they become so enveloped in a criminal society while living with other inmates. So, incarcerated means full of prisoners, which is there's so many prisoners inside the jail or mix mixed inmates who have committed different crime. It can cause them to pursue their wrongdoings if it will take long. So, regardless of these conflicting opinions on rehabilitation of criminals, imprisonment continues to be one of the most common forms of punishment around the world. So, imprisonment is used as a form of punishment in every country in the world. For statistics on the prison population of 223 independent countries and dependent terrorists to see the World Prison Brief. In most countries, it is the most severe form of punishment that courts can impose. Levels of imprisonment around the world have risen dramatically since the Second World War, though more rapidly in some regions than other, Corley at 2016. So, proponents of imprisonment often argue that the sanction of incarceration can be justified by incorporating many of the differing aims of punishment, highlighted above, namely through its incapacitative and deterrent effect, as well as through us ability to change and rehabilitate, and the notion that a prison sentence is a justly deserved and proportionate response to crime, according to Scott 2007. While there is often disagreement regarding the relative weight that should be given to these differing aims and the way in which prisons should operate, international law strongly emphasizes the importance of rehabilitation and reintegration in order to meet the primary purpose of imprisonment. So, imprisonment needs to rehabilitate or reintegrate the prisoners in order to make them change or to make them realize that crime should be reduced. The development of prisons. So, the development of prisons changed from the 1800s to the modern day era. As day of 1990, there were over 750,000 people held in state prison or county jails. Prisons hadn't been designed to house such a high number of incarcerated individuals. The development of a prison system during the 16th century, a number of houses of correction were established in Europe for the rehabilitation of minor offenders and vagrants. They emphasized strict discipline and hard labor. Over time, imprisonment came to be accepted as an appropriate method of punishing convicted criminals. So, in short, the development of prisons uh, is to create more housing for inmates to reduce incarcerated population of the prisoners. Next, we will talk about the Sing Sing prison. The programs of Sing Sing prison include every facility has a variety of programs to help incarcerated individuals, which can include alcohol and substance abuse treatment programs, anger management program, educational or vocational program, family development programs, guidance and counseling services, library and law library services, recreational programs, religious services, sex offender treatment program, temporary release programs, trauma programs, transitional service programs, veteran services, volunteer service, and programs. So, the prisoners can benefit all of these programs in Sing Sing prison. Next, explore the history of the notable Sing Sing prison. Sing Sing Correctional Facility is a maximum security level facility for males, limited only for males. So, it is an active maximum security prisons where the theories and realities criminal punishment and rehabilitation have played out for almost 200 years. So, Sing Sing Prison is a place with diverse stories from multiple perspectives. One of the country's most notable prisons has for 200 years led shifts in the national prison system, from the adoption of system stressing separation from other prisoners to major reform movements. So, the prisoners that specifically its historic cell block has for decades raised conversations surrounding major criminal justice issues such as the architecture of confinement, women in prison, progressive reform, corporal and capital punishment congregant, and contract labor, mass incarceration, and prisons in popular culture. So, as what I've said, Sing Sing Prison is only the facility of males or for males. In June 1, the discovery the dis, in June 1 discovered the history of Sing Sing Prison at the virtual event creating the Sing Sing Prison Museum. So the event will be led by Sing Sing Prison Museum Executive Director Brent Glass along with his staff. Tickets are free but exclusively for untapped New York insiders. Become a member today starting at just $10 a month. This event will focus on the historic salt block built along the Hudson River with rocks quarried by incarcerated men between 1825 to 1828 and on the plans to create the Sing Sing Prison Museum. The event will tell the extraordinary story of 200 years of incarceration at one of America's most iconic prison and as a site of conscience, challenge visitors to imagine a more equitable justice system and take action to build a better society. Next, Sing Sing Prison was located in Ossining, Westchester, was the fifth prison that New York State authorities constructed. In 1824, a warden at Auburn Prison, located in the Finger Lakes region, was tasked with constructing a more modern prison further downstate. After contemplating a location in Staten Island and the Bronx, the warden decided that the town of Mount Pleasant in Westchester along the Hudson River. In 130 acres site was named after a nearby village, which itself took its name from the whoppering words sink, sink, or stone up, stone. By May 1825, 100 incarcerated men were transferred to Sing Sing Prison from Auburn Prison, but the prison was not even finished by then. There was no place to receive them or wall to enclose them, and the construction of facilities like temporary barracks and a cookhouse was severely rushed. However, the main builders of the prison cell block was not the professional architect nor the state, it was the prisoners themselves. Starting in 1825, Sing Sing's inmates excavated marble from a nearby quarry to create a 487-foot long or 44 feet wide 4 stories building. The cell block had a capacity for 800 inmates and became the centerpiece for the small town, which also included workshops, a chapel, a hospital, and the nation's first female prison. It was not until November 18, 2028, after 3 years of labor's work, that the prisoner would be locked in their cells. Next. So, the construction did not stop at the cell block, though just 2 years later, the incarcerated mined enough Sing Sing marble to construct two additional buildings, one that served as the hospital and kitchen, and the other a chapel that could contain 900 men. So this includes to reduce incarcerated cases of inmates. Some of this marble was also used to construct the New York State Capitol Building, the United States Treasury Building, and sections of New York University. Sing Sing Prison was notorious for its harsh treatment toward the incarcerated. So, in simple term, Sing Sing Prison is a very dangerous prison. So, these men were subjected to the U-born system, named for U-born system, where the system of punishment was formulated with mining marble and performing other laborious tasks. The men worked silently in congregant labor group, and the silence continued into the night when prisoners were confined to their solitary cells. So, whipping and other violent punishment were common, and the lockstep system was used to control and move inmates throughout prison grounds. The oven system contrasted with the Pennsylvania system, which put more emphasis on solitary confinement to foster penitence. There were some attempts to reform this system in the 1840s, though. John Lucky, the prison chaplain, created a religious library at the prison that taught moral principles. And Eliza Farnham, who was warden of Mount Pleasant Female Prison, advocated for prison reform by introducing social engagement activities that eliminated the rule of silence for the woman. So, John Lucky created a religious library at the prison, which was Eliza Farnham was advocate to develop or to reform a social engagement activities. The focus now became on framing the incarcerated mindset for the future, not focusing entirely on their past crimes. Despite some disagreements between Lucky and Farnham, the library became a space for prisoners to engage in both religious and secular texts and to focus on education. Despite these reforms, the prison remained one of the country's most strict on the incarcerated. By 1860, the prison added 400 cells and Sing Sing system of congregant labor continued to serve as the dominant philosophy for the nation's penal system. In 1891, Sing Sing carried out its first execution as its death house, where 614 executions by electrocution took place until 1963. There were numerous death row escapes in the first few decades of the execution, but Sing Sing built a new death house in 1920 that had stricter security. So they built another death house, including more security. Using the chair or old sparkly, the prison executed such figures as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused of committing espionage for the Soviet Union, and Gerhard Poff, who murdered an FBI agent. By the early 1900s, many of the open system components were eradicated or reformed. Warden Thomas Matt Osborne established the mutual welfare led, essentially a system of internal self-rule. Osborne cracked down on prisoners who broke guards and intimidated others, and he was the subject of a conspiracy by those who lost their privileges to be indicated for crimes he did not commit. In the early 1900s, the lockstep system was abolished, and inmates were granted freedom of the yard in which they could converse with others and leave their solitary dorms. Under Warden Lewis' laws, the old hellhole was transformed into a modern prison, although executions will still occur rather regularly. Lewis introduced new educational programs and even organized sports teams, which is indicated in the picture below. For many years, the New York Yankees would play exhibition games against the incarcerated men. So they create sports to organize to reduce incarcerated cases. The New York Giants owner Tim Mara sponsored the Sing Sing Black Sheep, providing them with equipment and uniforms. So they provide everything they need. So, for a few years, the football program was extremely successful. So, it turns their plans success. The starting quarterback, Alabama Pitts, was signed by the Philadelphia Eagles upon his release, while Jumbo Morano was signed by the Giants. So, however, a 1936 rule banned the sale of tickets to football games, the revenue from which paid for disbursements to prisoners' families, and in that year, no inmate could play football outside of the prison, so only inside the prison. In addition to library and classrooms, the men also had access to a storehouse, barber shops, and a bathhouse as well as a chapel. Lewis has also allowed a former newspaper's editor to construct a birdhouse on the prison guards. The prison also became a popular movie backdrop, with Warner Bros. Donating funds to construct a prison gymnasium in 1934. 2 years after Lewis retired in 1941, the old cell block closed down and the metal bars and doors were donated to the war effort. In the 1972 court case, Foreman v. Georgia ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional of its application was inconsistent and arbitrary. Thus, execution stopped at Sing Sing. By then, the prison was completely different from its cruel past a century ago. In 1996, Catherine Wilkins founded Rehabilitation Through the Arts, in which prisoners receive a curriculum of theater-related workshop all the year. So, Catherine created or founded a rehabilitation, which is through arts of the to give the inmates an extracurricular theater-related workshops. So, the organization Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison also provides college courses to inmates both and Sing Sing at nearby prisons to reduce poverty and recidivism upon release. So, it could help the inmates to reduce their penalty. So, next, the Sing Sing Prison Museum is currently under development with plans to open a preview center in 2022. In the former prison powerhouse, museum organizers plan to connect the powerhouse to the historic cell block by 2025, the 200th anniversary of the prison's constructions. The museum anticipates having a projected annual attendance of more than 100,000 visitors, displaying the Sing Sing story as it unfolded over time. So, next. Throughout its 200-year history, Sing Sing Prison has led transformations in national prisons from the adoption of the Auburn system to the introduction of sports team and educational programs. Sing Sing has also become a cultural icon, featuring in the films and TV shows like Alieness, which depicted an execution, as what have you seen at the picture. So, Sing Sing Prison is the site of the infamous Death House. So, next, let's talk about Auburn or Newborn system. It is a penal method of the 19th century in which prisoners worked during the day and were kept in solitary confinement at night, which enforced silence at all times. So, in this system, the the prisons were worked during day and they were kept on solitary confinement during at night. The silent system evolved during the 1820s at Newborn or Auburn's prison in Newborn, New York, as an alternative to and modification of the Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement, which is gradually replaced in the United States. So, later innovations at Newborn were the lockstep or marching in single line, placing the right hand on the shoulders of the man ahead and facing toward the guard. So, the strip suit two arrangement at meals, all designed to ensure strict silence. This is to design to ensure to remain them silent. So, the Auburn and Pennsylvania system were both based on the belief that criminals' habits were learned from the reinforced by other criminals. See all Pennsylvania. In prison life, during the 19th century, prisoners had no rights nor any opportunity to live semi-comfortably. The Auburn system established several characteristics that were unique to the world of disciplinary conditions. Silence was the biggest factor among rules for the prisoners. John D. Cray, a deputy warden at the Auburn prison, demanded that prisoners be completely silent to take away the prisoners' or sense of self. When the sense of self was taken away, many convicts obeyed the warden's wishes. The second characteristic of the Auburn system was community activities. During regimented times, during the day, prisoners had tasks to perform. Some of these included making nails, barrels, clothing, shoes and balls, boots, carpets, buttons, carpenters, tools, steam engines, and boilers, combs, harnesses, furniture, brooms, clocks, buckets, and pails, saddles, and trees. All there are the activities of the Auburn system. During the 1840s, the prison began to produce silk using a silkworms and trees. The Auburn Correctional Facility was the first prison to profit from the prisoner labor. So the prison had many sighters in the 19th century. And the goal of this system was to instill good work habits and ideas of industry that were supposed to be rehabilitative. So this system composed of such many activities to make to to give the inmates a good work habits while they were in prison. So it is a very good idea. Punishment. In 1821, a new principal keeper, Elam Lintz, was appointed to run the prison. He believed in the disciplinary power of the lash and used flogging to punish even minor infractions. In 1839, a prisoner died from neglect and overflogging. The Committee of Auburn and other staff members of the Auburn theological seminary petition to bring the issue of the punishment to the state government. The law stated that 6 blows on the naked back with a cat or stranded whip was the most punishment that could be assigned for many one offense. In 1846, another meeting was congregated to abolish the use of whips. Flag- Flagellation could only be used for riots or severe cases. When whipping was prohibited, guards and keepers sought new ways to punish the disorderly. The shower bath consisted of a barrel about 4.5 feet high with a discharge tube at the bottom. The prisoner was stripped naked, bound hand and foot with a wooden collar around his neck to prevent him moving his head. This barrel, with the poured down, with the inmate inside the place directly under an outlet pipe, where water, sometimes ice, would pour down. Another form of punishment was the yoke. The yoke used iron bars around the neck and arms of the prisoners, so it is very harsh. So, it is very dangerous if you commit a crime. Woman and the prison. In the early days of prison, women inmates were held in the windowless attic out of the high security prison. They shared a single room and slept in the same area where they worked primarily at picking wool, knitting, and spooling. So, if they were working, so their prisons and which they are work is the only one place they could sleep though. In 1838, all women prisoners was transferred to the then new female wing at Sing Sing. So in 1892, the woman returned to a new building at the Newborn prison. The Newborn woman prison remained in operation until 1933. So when a new maximum security wing for female inmates opened at Benford, so the Newborn prison system, history and reform. In early punishment methods, Levis stared at the shackles on his wrist. The guard would be here soon, and he'd then find out his fate. By today's standards, punishment for breaking the law in early colonial times seems barbaric. There was no thought of rehabilitation or hope of reform, just retribution to give someone their just deserts. Murder and other infamous crimes were punished with death, while smaller offenses such as lying, conjuring, adultery, skipping church, and existing without means resulted in branding, floggings, maimings, and other forms of physical torture. Silence was the overriding theme of the newborn system. John D. Cray, a deputy warden at the newborn system, said silence took away the prisoner's sense of self, which made them more obedient. Thus, the prisoner did everything without talking. The congregate system has them both together for many activities and meals, all of which were done in silence. So at night, they were in their cell alone. So, this could be had a bad benefit of the inmates. Imagine you can talk inside whether you can only eat or sleep with their cells alone. So it could cause illness, mental illness. So, despite the silence, the inmates worked together as they made items like barrels, buckets, clothes, shoes, boots, tools, and saddles. These were sold at the profit making at the newborn system to the first to wade into the prison's manufacturing industry that became popular in 1800s or 1800s means. So, the genesis of the newborn system prison. Opening in, it opens in 1817 and with final completion in 1823. The Human prison in Newborn, New York was built with the new model in mind. It used a congregate system, which meant the inmates worked and eat together but went into isolation at night. So, the inmates engaged in hard labor and work on bridges, ditches, quarries, and other difficult and tedious work. So, flogging through outlawed as a sentence became the primary means of discipline. This soon became as the newborn prison system, which owes many of its attributes such as a better food and healthcare, and an increased emphasis on rehabilitation to the Pennsylvania system. What was the newborn system? The newborn system, named after the newborn prison in New York, was a variation of the Quaker-run Pennsylvania penitentiaries of the 19th century. Combining hard labor with solitary confinement, the prison system ought to rehabilitate criminals while using them to offset the expenses of running a jail. While many of the brutal disciplinary practices used in the Newborn system have been replaced, its foundations remain the model of many prisons throughout the world. So, until the late 18th century, jails in America were typically used for confinement prior to trials and sentencing. So, it is usually used for trial and sentencing. Most punishment were either execution or public penance of some kind, such as whipping. The idea of using jails as a criminal punishment was popularized by the Quakers of Pennsylvania, who disapproved of the constant execution due to their religious beliefs. So, in the Quaker system, prisoners were kept in total silence and solitary confinement for the duration of their sentence. The goal was to reform people who had become criminals, and prisoners were eventually allowed access to the Bible to help them return to a law-abiding life. So, the Quaker system used to help the prisoner to change or to discourage them not to not to not cre- to not to it discouraged the prisoners not to commit another crime when they were allowed to go out in the prison or their sentence is finished. Taking its cue from the Quaker system, the Auburn system also kept prisoners in solitary confinement most of the time. Not speaking was meant to help make inmates compliant, where enforced labor was a tool for rehabilitation. In principle, the labor prisoners were forced to do was for their own good, to teach them the value of hard work. Of course, the labor of the prisoners also brought profit to the prison system, leading some to believe that the prisoners were exploited for free labor. So they can have an income inside the prison, which when they were valued as, as sign of good hard work. Criticism of exploitation were hardly unjustifiable given the practice of charging admissions for tourists to enter the prison throughout the 19th century. While this did help to spread similar prison systems across the world, it was also used as a tool of humiliation for the prisoners. Seeing people freely enter and exit the prison on a daily basis could only emphasize their own lack of choices. So, many of the stereotypical prison image came from the newborn system. It was here that the horizontally stripped uniforms were introduced. These garments were meant to be humiliating and clearly identify prisoners for all to see. So, the Uber system also pioneered lockstep, the practice of forcing inmates to march together with their eyes down and only arm linked to the prison in front of them. For most of the 19th century, punishment in the Huber system was swift and severe. So it is more the system with the system is the punishment of the Huber system was increased or more more dangerous. A temperamental warden named Elam Lins enthusiastically called flogging as a routine punishment, leading to the death of at least one prisoner. By the turn of the 20th century, most of the corporal punishment had been abolished, as a vocal minority gained ground in insisting that prisoners should have some rights. Next, who is Elam Lins? Alan Lynch was born in Litchfield, Connecticut in 1784. His parents moved to Troy, New York when he was an infant. He learned the heater's trade and worked at it for some years. In the War of 1812, he held a captain commissions in a New York regiment when the Newborn State Prison was opened in 1817. Captain Lynch was made the first principal keeper, and 4 years afterwards, he became a warden of a Newborn State Prison. So, Elam Lynch is usually the first keeper, principal keeper of the prison, and it turns out that he became a warden of the Newborn State Prison. So, he made many experiments with a view to furnishing better occupation and to improving the general conditions of the prison. He devised the main features of what is now known as the Newborn system of imprisonment. So, when it was proposed to erect a new state prison at Mount Pleasant, New York in the Hudson River, Captain Lynch was selected to take charge of the enterprise. He began his work in 1823 and successfully prosecuted it for 4 years with prison labor. When the Sing Sing prison was completed according to the original plan, after his retirement from the prison severe, he lived in New York City where he died in 1855. Today, the newborn system was seem barbaric in nature, but at time it was actually in advance in humanity. Prior to the existing of long-term imprisonment, hundreds of offenses carried the death penalty, including denying God's existence and homosexuality. So, the reason of too many hundreds of offenses carried the death penalty, which is include to deny the God's existence. So, the aim of prison system was to rehabilitate inmates through labor and enforced solitude. While carrying brutal consequences, it also gave person the chances of redemption, a humanistic concept in an often unforgiving world. Next, let's talk about Pennsylvania system. It is an early prison system requiring inmates silence, individual cells, and inmates labor in those cells. Pennsylvania system penal method based on the principle that solitary confinement fosters penitence and encourages reformation. This idea was advocated by the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, whose most active members were Quakers. So, Pennsylvania system is the one who encouraged the inmates who encouraged the system to reform. So it is the system to encourage the prisoners to change, or it is the system that to encourage reformations. In 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary on Cherry Hill in Philadelphia applied this so-called separate philosophy. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in cells 16 feet high, nearly 12 feet long, and 7.5 feet wide. An exercise yard completely enclosed to prevent contact among prisoners. was attached to each cell. Prisoners saw no one except institution officers and in occasional visitors. So, solitary penitence, however, was soon modified to include the performance of work such as shoemaking or weaving. The Pennsylvania system spread until it predominated in European prisons. Critics in the United States argued that it was too costly and had deleterious effects on the minds of the prisoners. The Pennsylvania system was superseded in the United States by the U-born system. So, in early prison history of the Pennsylvania system. So, unlike U-born or Sing Sing, Pennsylvania Eastern Penitentiary in 1829 was intended to keep convicts separate even as they worked, in order to prevent any earthly contamination or distraction that might impede their repentance, hence the term penitentiary. It is located on Cherry Hill on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Eastern represented one of the most imposing and expensive architectural achievements in the United States to date, and it's contained innovations such as running water and flush toilets in all the cells. Although Beaumont and Tocqueville found it incontestable that this perfect isolation secures the prisoners from all fatal contamination, they favored the more cost-effective Newborn plan, which seems more likely to enable states to profit from convicts' labor. Francis Xavier, the Prussian immigrant scholar who translated Beaumont and Tocqueville work into English, hailed America's new penitentiary system as monuments of charitable disposition of the honest members of society toward their fallen and unfortunate brethren. Liebig coined the term penology to describe that branch of criminal science which occupies itself with the punishment of the criminal, not with the definition of crimes, the subject of accountability, and the proving of the crime, which belongs to the criminal law and the penal process. Another prominent foreign visitor to Eastern Penitentiary was much more critical of the uncompromising solitary confinement approach. After touring, after touring the institution in 1842, Charles Dickens, the English novelist, concluded in his American Notes in 1842 that the Pennsylvania plan was cruel and wrong. So, Charles Dickens noted that Pennsylvania plan was cruel and wrong, or dangerous, and it is not right, saying he found this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. The Pennsylvania prison system history and reform. From colonial times to the present, the purpose, methods, and execution of criminal punishment has dramatically changed. In this lesson, we will look at the early Pennsylvania prison system and learn its role in prison reform in the United States. So, in early punishment, his fellow colonists could tell William lived in a life of crime. His ears were cropped and lash marks scared his back. His right palm bore a charge for burglary, and on the left are for Raj. If his crimes piled any higher, that was the last best hope the colony leaders has for his reform. His great-grandson, Edward, has led a life of crime in the Pennsylvania colony, but no scars or bands betrayed his deeds. By today's standards, crime and punishment in early colonial times seem both petty and horrific. During William's times, retribution where the convicted person is given their just deserts was the primary goal, and punishment was both excruciating, and public. A death sentence meant those who committed the biggest, like murder and rape. So, the biggest crime committed is rape and murder. But for all of these other sins like lying, conjuring, adultery, skipping church, and being without means, various levels of pain, torture, and public humility were ordered. Respite or the brain of reform. So, William Penn, founder of the Pennsylvania colony, having suffered in the prisons of England. So, he suffered. Ushered in reforms in 1680. Those convicted of small crimes got bail, and more serious crimes were punished by hard labor. The jails were replaced with workhouses where the incarcerated persons worked most of the day and learned a trade to contribute to society when released. Free food and rudimentary health was provided. Torture and humiliation was replaced with a medicum of dignity and humanity. So, William Penn, William Penn is conducting a reform to which is change the torture and humiliation to dignity and humanity. Penn died in 1718, and by all accounts, his reforms died with him. So, the reforms was not yet done. However, many scholars give Penn credit for moving the needle of reform, if only a few degrees. Hard labor and floggings replaced branding and maiming, and though retribution was still the stated goal, reformation of the offending person was now being openly considered. So, yes, his his contribute was success or considered or approved. The Quakers' Friends and the Pennsylvania Prison Society. In 1787, Benjamin Franklin and a group of fellow Quakers formed the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. This later became the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and they began this later became the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and they began lobbying for significant reforms in the prison system. In 1790, they got their wish. Legislation was passed that converted the city jail built on Walnut Street in 1773 to the nation's first penitentiary, a prison with the purpose of rehabilitation and reform. The Quakers believed that a separate system should be instituted where an imprisoned person could seek penitence through isolation and reflection. The Walnut Street jail was converted and small. One-person rooms with only a small unreachable windows were added. The confined person was given materials and tools to make shoes, nails, tools, and clothes. They were used in the prison system, and surpluses were sold to the public. They saw no one but their guard, and they only once, and then only once again, and then only once a day. So their their products was sold to the public. The Pennsylvania Prison Society pressured the legislature to expand the Walnut Street model across the state. Dignitaries and officials from other states and England visited to see and judge these reforms for themselves. This became known as the Pennsylvania prison system, which possessed the following attributes. So, first, it used isolation to foster penitence as the imprisoned person has time to reflect on his or her misdeeds. Second, it was humanitarian based as it provided better food and health care. Third, convicted persons work alone to make goods and learn a trade, so learn from their own. Fourth, the focus moved from retribution to rehabilitation. So its focus is to rehabilitate. The end of an era. The Pennsylvania reforms brought overcrowding and increased cost. Soon, the individual rooms gave way to larger rooms with multiple occupants. The fewer incarcerated people learned a skill as demand dried up for their products. The prison devolved into human storehouses. The Pennsylvania prison system has its origin in an effort to correct the abuses in the place of incarceration of all classes violations of law. The common jail, under the colonial government of the province of Pennsylvania, was a receptacle of every such offender. In the city prison of Philadelphia, located at Market and 3rd Streets in 1770, young and old, black and white, men and women, boys and girls were congregated indiscriminately in custody for misconduct, misdemeanor, and felony either before trial. So, after conviction or for want of bail for surety of the peace, it was a moral pest house. Bad as it was better than Newgate, for England was without a rival and a infamous management of her then chief of public prison in London. So as early as 1775, a sensible, thoughtful man, a merchant, Mr. Richard Wistar, residing nearby, has this attention directed to the horrible condition of these city prisons. In 1776, on the 7th of February, society was formed styled the Philadelphia Society for Assisting Distressed Prisoners. The occupation of Philadelphia by the British Army terminated the labors of the society in the month of September 1777. In the year 1787, May 8, the first society was revived by its successor, or the Philadelphia Society of Alleviating the Misery of Public Prisons. Some of the members of the First Society and others like-minded engaged in the survival of the organization of 1776. So, what is a prison? Prison is an institution for the confinement of persons who have been remanded or held in custody by a judicial authority or who have been deprived of their liberty following convictions of a crime. A person found guilty of a felony or a misdemeanor may be required to serve a prison sentence. So that was a prison. The holding of accused mere prison awaiting trial remains an important function of contemporary prisons. And in some countries, such persons constitute the majority of the prison population. In the United Kingdom, for example, generally about one-fifth of the prison population is unconvicted or unsentenced, while more than two-thirds of those in custody in India are pre-trial detainees. Until the late 18th century, prisons were used primarily for the confinement of debtors, persons accused of crimes and awaiting trials, and convicts awaiting the imposition of their sentences. Usually, death or transportation or deportation overseas, a sentence of imprisonment was rarely imposed, or and then only for also minor crimes. As the use of capital punishment began to decline in the late 18th century, the prisons was increasingly used by courts as a place of punishment. So they use prisons to increase uh, increase the increase the cases of the punishment, eventually becoming the chief means of punishing serious offenders. The use of imprisonment subsequently spread worldwide, often by means of colonial empires that brought the practice to countries with no indigenous concept of prisons. By the early 21st century, a majority of countries have abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. And imprisonment was consequently the most severe form of punishment their courts could impose. The development of prison system. During the 16th century, a number of houses of correctional were established in Europe for the rehabilitation of minor offenders and bargains. They emphasized strict disciplines and hard labor. Over time, imprisonment came to be accepted as an appropriate method of punishing convicted criminals. Poor sanitation in this constitution caused widespread disease among prisoners, who were generally held and segregated without any consideration for gender or legal status. Outbreaks of epidemic typhus, known as jail fever, or occasionally killed not only prisoners but also jailers and more rarely judges and lawyers involved in trials. So, this is the outbreak of epidemic typhus, which is more rarely or kill someone in the prisons, which include judge, lawyers, and also some people involved in the trial. So, the modern prison developed in the late 18th century in part as a reaction to the conditions of the local jails of the time. So, the emergence of the penitentiary. The concept of the prison as a penitentiary, that is a place of punishment and prison reform, was advocated in this period by the English jurist and philosopher Jeremy Bentham, as what I said a while ago. So, among others, the appalling conditions and official corruption in many local prisons of the late 18th century England and Wales were exposed by the English prison reformer Dan Howard, whose works but at the State of the Prisons in England and Wales 1777 and an account of the principal lazarettas in Europe in 1789 were based on extensive travels. The public outrage that Bentham and Howard helped generate led to a national system of inspection and the construction of convict prisons. For those serving longer sentences, consequently, in the early 19th century, penitentiaries were established in the U.S. states of Pennsylvania and New York. As use of the new type of prison expanded, administrators began to experiment with new methods of prisoners' rehabilitation. Solitary confinement of criminals came to be viewed as an idea because it was thought that solitude would help the offender to become penitent and that penitence would result in rehabilitation. In the United States, the idea was first implemented at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia in 1829. Each prisoner remained in his cells or its adjoining yard, work alone, work alone, and trades such as weaving, carpentry, or shoemaking, and saw no one except the officers of the institution and the occasional visitors from outside. So they were individually remained in their cells. This method of prison management, known as the separate system or the Pennsylvania system, became a model for penal institutions constructed in several other U.S. states and throughout much of Europe. So, Pennsylvania system known as a separate system, which include the individuals remain in their cells. A completing philosophy of prison management known as the silent system or the Euborn system. So Euborn system means silent system. And Sing Sing prison is the more harsh system. Arose of roughly the same time, although constant silence was strictly enforced. The distinguishing feature of this system was that prisoners were permitted to work together in the daytime. Both systems held to the basic premise that contact between convicts should be prohibited in order to minimize the bad influence inmates might have been on one another. Vigorous competition between supporters of the two systems followed until about 1850, by which time most U.S. states had adopted the silent system. The concept of personal reform became increasing, important in penology, resulting in experimentation with various methods. One example was the mark system, which was developed about 1840 by Captain Alexander McConaughey at Norfolk Islands. Prisoners who obtained the required number of credits became eligible for release. The mark system presaged the use of indeterminate sentences, individualized treatment, and parole. Above all, it emphasized training and performance rather than solitude as the chief mechanism of reforms. Further refinements in the mark system were developed in the mid-19th century by Sir Walter Crofton, the director of Irish prisons. In his program, known as the Irish system, prisoners progressed through three stages of confinement before they were returned to civilian life. The first proportion of the sentence was served in isolation. After that, prisoners were assigned to group work projects. Finally, for 6 or more before release, the prisoners were transferred for intermediate prisons, where they were supervised by unarmed guards and given sufficient freedom and responsibility to demonstrate their fitness for release. Release nothing less depended upon the continued good conduct of the offender, who could be returned to prison if necessary. Many features of the Irish system was adopted by reformatories constructed in the United States in the late 19th century for the treatment of youthful and first offender. The leaders of the reformatory movements advocated the classification and segregation of various types of prisoners, individualized treatment emphasizing vocational education and industrial employment, indeterminate sentences, and reward for good behavior, and parole or conditional release. The reformatory philosophy gradually permeated the entire U.S. prison system. In the American innovations, in combination with the Irish system, has great impact upon European prison practices, leading to innovations such as the Bristol system of rehabilitation of youthful offenders in the 20th century. The purpose of imprisonment. So, the purpose of imprisonment is to one approach aims to deter those who would otherwise commit crimes, and to make it less likely that those who serve a prison sentence will commit crimes after their release. The first approach of the purpose of the imprisonment is to discourage the prisoners to not commit a crime, or to less likely that do serve person sentence will commit crimes after release. So they need it encourage to not to it encourage the prisoners not to commit crime when they were released from the prison. A second approach focuses on ensuing punishment to or obtaining retribution from those who have committed serious crimes. A third approach encourages a person reform for those who are sent to prison. Finally, in some cases, it is necessary to protect the public from those who commit crimes, particularly from those who do so presently. In individual cases, all or some of this justification may apply. The increasing importance of the notion of reform has led some prison system to be called correctional institution. Types of prisons. Prisons are distributed among a variety types of institution. Most countries operate national prison system that are supplemented by state or provincial counterparts. In the United States, for example, criminal sentences for federal offenses are held in institutions or varying levels of security operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In countries with a federal system of government such as Brazil, Germany, and India, prisons are administered not by the nations, but the national government by individual states. The vast majority of prisoners worldwide are adult males. So, one of this minority have committed very serious crime. It is the responsibility of the prison system to protect the public from such a convict at all costs. For the most serious criminals, there are high security prisons where the movement of every prisoner is closely supervised so that they have a little chance of escaping. For the majority, there are medium security prisons where prisoners are expected to work, attend educational programs, or participate in other activities. Finally, there are prisoners that have a very low level of security for those who present no threat to public safety. So, they are strictly guard the inmates who is very, for example, he committed a big or a or the most dangerous crime he commit he he is a very homelessness or a hopeless prisoners, while those prisons have a secu- low level of crime, which is was no no threat to public safety. The supervisions in the late in the 19th and early 20th century, prisons were viewed as total institutions that exert control every aspects of the prisoner's life. So in addition, the scheduled routines such as for meals, rising and retiring, exercising, and bathing. Main, Many other aspects of this prisoner's life were subjected to strict supervisions. These supervisions not only included the prisoners, but to contact their families. It is not important only for the prisoners, but also the family members of the prisoners. Order and discipline. Although prisons are intended to be institutions where good order prevails, if it's possible for order to break down in certain circumstances, it is the responsibility of prison administrators to ensure that each arriving prisoners understand that what type of behavior is expected and what acts are forbidden. In addition, there must be a clear set of disciplinary sanctions for acts of indiscipline. In all such cases, the normal processes of natural justice should apply. Any resulting punishment should be proportional to the offense that was committed. Serious acts, where would usually be classified as criminal, should be dealt with a more serious manner. In some cases, the civil police in other countries such as France and Spain, these cases are handled by the visiting judge or magistrate. Oversight. Many countries recognize the need for third party oversight of their prison system. The United Kingdom and the state of Western Australia appointed independent inspectors for this purpose, while many countries on continental Europe appoint a visiting judge who oversees prison system. There are also forms of independent regional inspections. The member countries of the Council of Europe, for example, are subject to inspection by the Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment of Punishment. The privatization. As government faced the problem created by burgeoning prisons population in the late 20th century, including overcrowding, poor sanitation, and riots, a few sorts of solution in turning over prison management to the private sector. The term prison privatization can be applied to a variety of arrangements involving non-governmental contractors. One privatization model, which originated in France and later spread to a number of countries, arranged responsibilities that shuts influence control ineffectual that related to the provision of liberty, while other services are contracted out to non-governmental companies. In a further modern of privatization, the entire operation of a prison is contracted to a commercial business or a not-for-profit organization. But this centers into a contract with a company that operates and manages the prisons. A more extensive model of privatization occurs in cases where a commercial company takes a prison from drawing board to final operation. The latter argues to provide a set of number of prison places to a contractual standard. The state in turn agrees to pay the set of numbers of places over a contractually agreed upon period of time. The prison population in national trends. By the early 21st century, there were more than 9 million men, women, and children in prisons around the world, most of whom were located in three countries, which was the United States, with more than 2 million prisoners, in China, with more than 1.5 million prisoners, and Russia, with roughly 1 million prisoners. So, United States, which was more than 1 million prisoners. Prior to the mid 20th century, the number of incarcerated individuals worldwide have been far lower. The general rise in prison population has been attributed to a variety of factors. Available evidence suggests that it is a consequences of greater public awareness of crime. Even in jurisdictions that has now experienced an increase in crime rates. Changes in legislation that leave judge-like sentencing, flexibility in individual cases, and police targeting of drug-related offense since the 1980s. It is not less very difficult to identify a correspondence between crimes rates and rates of imprisonment. In 1880, England prison population stood at 32,000. After the prisons came under central government control, there was a long period of decline in the number of prisoners, probably the result of changes in sentencing laws and practices. In England, and Wales exceeded 80,000. A similar trend occurred in the United States. Roughly 250,000 persons were incarcerated in the penitentiary in 1975, but the number of the prisoners increased exponentially through the remainder of the 28th century. Although most industrialized societies experienced a rapid increase in prison population after World War, the opposite trend was observed in the Netherlands, where the prison's population was halved from 1950 to 1970. In most prison systems, minority groups are significantly overrepresented. This is especially true of racial minorities, such as African Americans in the United States, Roma in Central Europe, Aborigines in Australia, and Maori in New Zealand. The prisoner's rights. As an aspect of human rights, the concept of prisoner's rights has been upheld by a number of international declarations and national constitution. In International Covenant and System Civil and Political Rights, Article 10, which states all persons deprived of their liberty shall be treated with humanity and with respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. The forms of punishment. After the completion of the trial, the court sentences the guilty to a punishment which is directly proportional to the severity of crime committed by him. The sentencing usually differs from one jurisdiction to another. A felony, for instance, which may amount to capital punishment according to the judicial system of a particular country, may only amount of life imprisonment in another. This being said, punishment is a broad concept which is open to several interpretations. However, at the end of the day, everything comes down to a same objective to ensure that justice prevails in this society. Imprisonment. Imprisonment or incarceration, wherein the person is put in jail as a lawful punishment, is perhaps one of the most common punishment in the world. Retribution, the act of correcting a person for his misconduct, is the main purpose of imprisonment. Besides this, it also serves other purposes like deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation, as what as I report from the past from the lesson 1. The term or the period that a convict has to spend in the prisons depends on several factors, most prominent ones being the area of jurisdiction and severity of the crime, even though it is one of the most common forms of punishment. So it is the most common. Even imprisonment has been subjected to criticism as a result of incidents wherein people falsely accused to a crime has to spend lifetime in prison. Probation. Probation is most often used in lieu of imprisonment. A person is sentenced to probation for misdemeanors as well as felony of the lesser degree. In some cases, the convict may have spent a part of the sentence in prison. The person or probation is supposed to abide by the probation condition set by the court. For instance, he is restricted from possessing weapons or moving out of the area of jurisdiction. The probation officer is assigned the task to ensure that the person follows these rules properly. If required, the court that can change its order and send the convict back to the prison. That is a probation. Fine and restitution. Though both involve paying a particular sum of money, there's a difference between the two. So, these are the difference. Fine is supposed to be paid by the convict to the government. So, it is supposed to be paid by the government, while restitution is supposed to be paid by the convict as a compensation to the affected party. This form of punishment is generally given when the judge is convinced that the convict is not a threat to the society. In case of a fine, it can either be given individually or along with a specific period of imprisonment. If required, the court can also confiscate the property of the convict. especially when the crime is serious and the person convicted is in no position of paying the fine. Community service. A form of alternative sentencing, community service requires the convicts to work for the society, either partly or entirely. In lieu of the sanction of fine imposed on him, generally, a person is sentenced to community service for varying degrees of misdemeanor, or for a community service for varying degrees, non-violent felony. Though in rare cases, the person may have to get involved in a specific activity related to the crime. For instance, a person held for possession of banned substance may have to join a group working to create awareness about the hazard of the substance abuse. As the law believes that allowing a celebrity to do community service for the sort will result in some good to the society. The capital punishment. Capital punishment, also referred to as the death penalty, is by far the most severe form of punishment. The most important objectives of capital punishment are deterrence, conveying a message that such acts will not be tolerated in this society. Basically, punishment is given to an individual to make him repent, ensure justice to the victim, and set an example for the rest of the society. If punishment serves even one of these purposes, then sentencing is a necessity. What are the types of criminal punishment? So, here are. Throughout history, society has developed different ways to simultaneously punish criminal offenders while also ensuring the safety of the public. So public first. Those who studies those who study types of crimes and their punishment learn that five major types of criminal punishment have emerged. First, incapacitation, incapacitation. Second, deterrence. Third, retribution. Fourth, rehabilitation. And last, restoration. The types of punishment listed by the University of Oxford Handbook include the first four of the following. The idea of the restorative justice is newer. Today's experts in criminology see it as a valid criminal punishment option. Those who judge the types of crimes and their punishment typically use one of the following approaches to guide them. So, first, retribution. This is the one of the first most This is the one of the first forms of punishment. So retribution is the first forms of punishment. Essentially, the idea of an eye for an eye. Those who favor retribution believe it gives the victims of crime, or society as a whole, a sense of satisfaction knowing a criminal received the appropriate level of punishment for the crime committed. Lawmakers face the task of determining these appropriate levels of punishment, which can range from speeding ticket fine amounts to mandatory sentences for certain crimes. Second, deterrence. Deterrence aims to prevent future crime and can focus on specific general deterrence. Specific deterrence deals with making an individual less likely to commit a future crime because of fear of getting a similar or worse punishment. Generally, deterrence refers to the impact on the members of the public who become less likely to commit a crime after learning of the punishment of another person experience. So deterrence, it aims to prevent future crime. So it it's the purpose of deterrence is to prevent future crimes and focus on general deterrence. Third, rehabilitation. Rehabilitation means seeks to provide or to prevent future crime by altering a criminal's behavior. This typically includes offering a host of programs while in prisons, including educational and vocational programs, treatment center placement, and mental health counseling. that was under the rehabilitation, which was include an extracurricular activities such as education or vocational programs or treatment for the prisoners. This approach also typically gives judges the flexibility to mix in rehabilitation programs as part of the criminal sentencing. The goal of rehabilitation is to lower the rate of recidivism or people committing another crime after getting released from the prison. So it prevents the prisoner to reduce or not to commit another crime when they were released from prison. So, incapacitation. This is another incident approach that remains popular. Incapacitation simply means removing a person from society. This includes incarceration in prisons or house arrest and its more dire form, execution. Many feel the flaw in this approach is that it doesn't address rehabilitation or recidivism, the latter of which tends to remain high in societies that practice incapacitation. And lastly, restoration is a new approach to criminal justice cell calls for the offender to make direct amends for the victim for their crime, as well as the community where the crime occurred. Judges use this approach mostly with juvenile offenders. In this approach, the criminal and the victim meet so that the offender can hear that the victim says about their experience of the crime committed. The offender then strives to make amends and seek forgiveness. These theories are intricately involved in studies and the types of crimes and their punishment. Society developed each of them with the idea of ensuring appropriate punishment for criminals and safety for the society. The Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reasons or simply the Enlightenment. It was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated Europe in the 17th and 18th century with global influence and effects. The Enlightenment includes a range of ideas centered in the value of human happiness. The, the pursuit of knowledge obtained by means of reason and the evidence of the sentences, and ideals such as liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. The Enlightenment has its roots in a European intellectual and scholarly movement known as Renaissance humanism and is also preceded by the scientific revolution and the work of Francis Bacon, among others. Philosophers and scientists of the period widely circulated their ideas through meetings at scientific academies, Masonic lodge, literary salons, coffee houses, and in printed books, journals, and pamphlets. The idea of the Enlightenment undermined the authority of the monarchy in the Catholic Church and paved the way for the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. A variety of 19th century movements, including liberalism, unionism, and neoclassicism, traced their intellectual heritage to the Enlightenment. In France, the central doctrines of the Enlightenment philosophers were individual liberty and religious tolerance, in opposition to an obsolete monarchy and the fixed dogmas of the Church. The father of Age of Enlightenment. Although they both lived and worked in the late 17th century, Sir Isaac Newton and John Locke in 1632 to 1704 were the true fathers of the Enlightenment. So, Isaac Newton and John Locke influenced the significant pieces in the Enlightenment by applying scientific notions and giving individuals the courage to break away from government. Isaac Newton came up with the scientific study that the universe was subjugated by the force of gravity, distance, and mass. Newton was the last of the scientific geniuses of the age and his great Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, mathematical principle of natural philosophy, was the culmination of the movement that's begun with Copernicus and Galileo. The first scientific synthesis based on the application of mathematics to nature in every detail. The basic idea of the authority and autonomy of reasons, which is dominated all philosoph- philosophizing in the 18th century, was at bottom the consequence of Newton's work. Newton's comprehensive mechanistic system made it seem as if at last nature had done do so. It is impossible to exaggerate the enormous enthusiasm at this assumption, kindled in all the major thinkers of the late 17th and 18th century. From Locke to Kant, the new enthusiasm for reason they are all instinctively shared was based not upon the more advocacy of philosophers such as Descartes and Leibniz, but upon their conviction that, in the spectacular achievements of Newton, reason has succeeded in conquering the natural world. The Enlightenment brought political modernization to the West in terms of focusing on democratic values and institutions and the creation of modern liberal democracies. Enlightenment thinkers sought to curtail the political power of organized religion and thereby prevent another age of intolerant religious war. In Promise, Kant depicted the promise of enlightenment as that of thinking on one's own authority, whereby human reason would lead to freedom and progress. The three major ideas of the Enlightenment. Terms in this set 22 and in 18th century intellectual movement whose three capital concepts were: first, the use of reasons; second, the scientific method; and last, the progress. Enlightenment thinkers believed they could help create better societies and better people. The personalities behind correctional institution. In early life, Cesar Beccaria was the son of a Milanese aristocrat of modest means. From an early age, he displayed the essential traits of his character. A highly volatile temperament resulted in periods of enthusiasm followed by depressions and inactivity. He was reserved and somewhat artistic in his social contacts, but placed great value in his personal and family relationships. At the age of 8, he was sent to the Jesuit school in Parma. Beccaria later described the education he received there as fanatical and stifling to the development of human feelings. In 1760, Beccaria's proposed marriage to the 16-year-old Teresa Blasco encountered the obdurate opposition of his father. The following year, the marriage took place without parental consent. The young couple began their life together in poverty. The breach between father and son was ultimately repaired, and Beccaria and his wife were received into the family home. In 1762, a daughter, the first of these three children, was born. In his work in economics, in 1771, he was appointed to the Supreme Economic Council of Milan and remained a public official for the remainder of his life. In his public role, Beccaria became concerned with a large variety of measures, including monetary reform, labor relations, and public education, a report written by Beccaria, influenced the subsequent adoption of the metric system in France. Beccaria rationality, versatility, and insistence in the unity of knowledge were typical of the intellectual life of his time. His treatise, the most important volume ever written on criminal justice, is still profitably consulted more than 2 centuries after its first appearance. Second, Marquis of Beccaria Bonisana. He was an Italian criminologist, a jurist, philosopher, an economist and politician who is widely considered one of the greatest thinkers of the Age of Enlightenment. So Marcus Beccaria was one of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment. He is well remembered for his treatise on crimes and punishment in 1764, which condemned torture and the death penalty, and was a founding work in the field of phrenology and the classical school of criminology. Beccaria is considered the father of modern criminal law and the father of criminal justice. Beccaria on Crimes and Punishment was best known for his book on crimes and punishment in 1764 with the encouragement of Pietro Verri. Beccaria published a brief but celebrated treatise on crimes and punishment. Beccaria treatise marked the high point of the Milan Enlightenment. In it, Beccaria put forth some of the first modern arguments against the death penalty. The brief work recently protests against torture to obtain confessions, secret accusations, the arbitrary discretionary power of judge, the inconsistency and inequality of sentencing using personal connections to get a lighter sentence, and the use of capital punishment for serious and even minor offenses. Contemporary political philosophers distinguish between two principal theories of justifying punishment. So first, the retributive approach maintains that punishment should be equal to the harm done, either literally than eye for an eye, or more figuratively, which allows for alternative forms of approach, is utilitarian, which maintains that punishment should increase in total amount of happiness in the world. The often involves punishment as a means of performing the criminal, incapacitating him from repeating his crime, and deterring others. So, Beccaria clearly takes a utilitarian stance. For Beccaria, the purpose of punishment is to create a better society, or not revenge. So, punishment serves to deter others from committing crimes and to prevent the criminal from repeating his crime. So, according to Beccaria, he proposed that punishment is to create a better society, but not to revenge. His punishment is to discourage another committing crimes to prevent criminal from repeating their crimes. Cesar Lombroso. Cesar Lombroso was born on November 6, 1835 in Verona, Austrian Empire, or now so-called in Italy. And he died on October 1999 in Turin, Italy. He is a criminologist whose views, though now largely discredited, brought about a shift in criminology from a legalistic preoccupation with crime to a scientific study of criminals. Lombroso studied at the universities of Padua, Vienna, and Paris, and from 1862 to 1876, he was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pavia. In 1871, he became director of the mental asylum of Pesaro, and in 1876, he became professor of forensic medicine and hygiene at the University of Turin, where he subsequently held appointment as professor of psychiatry in 1896 and then of criminal anthropology in 1906. Lombroso tried to discern a possible relationship between criminal psychopathology and physical or constitutional defects. His chief contention was the existence of the hereditary or atavistic class of criminals who are in effect biological throwbacks to a more primitive stage of human evolution. So Lombroso contended that such criminals exhibit a higher propensity of physical and mental anomalies than do non-criminals. Among these anomalies, which he termed stigmata, view various unusual skull size and asymmetries of the facial bones. Lombroso's theories were widely influential in Europe for a time, but his emphasis on heredity, causes of crime, was later strongly rejected in favor of the environment factors. Lombroso is tried to reform the entire penal system, and he encouraged more human and constructive treatment of convicts through the use of workshop program, intended to make them productive members of society. So, Cesar Lombroso improved that or encouraged the Italian penal system to make a human and constructive treatment of convicts to use of work programs to intended to make them more productive members of the society. William the Conqueror. William is or the Duke of Normandy or a Duke of Normandy from 1035 and King of England from 1066. William the Conqueror was one of the greatest soldiers and rulers of the Middle Ages. He made himself the mightiest noble in France and then changed the course of England's history by his conquest of the country. In early years, William was the elder of the two children of Robert the First of Normandy and his concubine Herleva, also called Arlette, the daughter of the tanner or undertaker from the town of Falaise. Sometime after William's birth, Herleva was married to Herlion, Viscount of Canterville, by whom she bore two sons, including Odo, the future bishop of Bayeux, and at least one daughter. In 1335, Robert died while returning from the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and William, his only son, whom he had nominated as her heir before his departure, was accepted as duke by the Norman magnates by his overlord King Henry I of France. William was a ruler of Normandy, reached his 15th year, was knighted, and began to play a personal part in the affairs of his duchy. The worst was over. William soon learned to control his youthful recklessness. He was always ready to take calculated risks on campaign and to light a battle, but he was not a flamboyant commander. His plans were simple, his methods direct, and he ruthlessly exploited any opportunity. If he found himself at a disadvantage, he withdrew immediately. So he is a very active ruler of Normandy. Enrico Ferri. Enrico Ferri was an Italian criminologist, socialist, and student of Cesar Lombroso. So Enrico Ferri was a student also for Cesar Lombroso, the founder of the entire school of criminology. While Lombroso researched the purported psychological factors that motivated criminals, Ferri investigated social and economic aspects. So, he served as editor of the socialist daily Adventi and in 1884 saw his criminal sociology published. Later, his work served as the basis of Argentina Penal Code of 1821. Although, the first he rejected the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, Ferri later became one of the Mussolini and his National Fascist Party's main external supporters. So, wait. Ferri was born in Lombardy in 1856 and worked first as a lecturer and later as a professor of criminal law, having spent time as a student of Cesar Lombroso. While Lombroso researched anthropological criminology, Ferri focused more on social and economic influences in criminal and crime rates. Ferry research led to him postulating theories calling for crime prevention methods to be the mainstay of law enforcement as opposed to punishment of criminals after their crimes have taken place. He became a founder of the Positivist School and he researched the psychological and social positivism as opposed to the biological positivism of Lombroso. In criminology theories, Ferry disputed Lombroso's emphasis in biological characteristics of criminals. Instead, he focused on the study of psychological characteristics, which he believed accounted for the development of crime in an individual. So he believed the development of crime in individual, not usually on the biological characteristics. These characteristics included slang, handwriting, secret symbols, literature, and art, as well as moral insensibility and a lack of repugnance to the idea and to the execution of offense previous to its commission and the absence of remorse after committing it. Ferry argued that sentiments such as religion, love, honor, and loyalty did not contribute to criminal behavior, as these ideas were too complicated to have a criminal behavior. It is too complicated to have a definite impact on a person's basic moral sense, from which Ferry believed criminal behavior stemmed. Ferry argued that other sentiments such as hate, cupidity, and vanity had greater influence as they held more controls over a person's moral sense. Ferry summarized his theory by defining criminal psychology as a defective resistance to criminal tendencies and temptations due to that ill-balanced impulsiveness which characterizes children and savages. Next, Clifford Shaw. Clifford, Clifford Rob Shaw in 1895 till 1957 was an American sociologist and criminologist. He was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 1940s, and is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. Okay, so his work on juvenile delinquency with Henry D. Mackay, conducted in the late juvenile delinquency with Henry Mackay in 1920s, played a pivotal role in moving the study of such delinquency toward the discipline of sociology. And away from psychology and psychiatry, Shaw and Mackay work spanned the three general areas, studying geographic variation in rates of juvenile delinquency, the study of autobiographical work by delinquents, and the development of Chicago Area Project, a delinquency prevention program in the Chicago area. The two studies published by Shaw and Mackay in the 1930s and 1940s were still held in high regard among social scientists in the 1970s. So, that's all. Thank you for watching and listening.